Was Jesus Christ, beyond being a major religious figure, also one of the greatest philosophers humanity has ever known? Before being called the Messiah, the Son of God, or the Savior, Jesus was a radical thinker, someone who challenged political power, broke with the dominant morality of his time, and proposed a revolutionary ethics grounded in love for others, forgiveness, and the dignity of the forgotten. In this video, we're going to dive into the philosophy of Jesus, not through faith, but through thought, teachings that, even today, still question the system, the logic of violence, and even our own values. Love your neighbor as yourself. Matthew 22:39. That sentence, spoken by Jesus of Nazareth, has echoed for more than 2,000 years as one of the most revolutionary and challenging principles ever proclaimed. It's not just a nice ethical suggestion, it's presented as the highest law for how humans should live together. And what's remarkable is how that simple line carries real philosophical power, crossing centuries, religions, moral systems, and even pure reason. When Jesus puts loving your neighbor on the same level as loving yourself, he invites a radical shift to look at another person with the same dignity and importance we normally reserve for ourselves. That takes empathy, compassion, and responsibility, but above all, a deeper awareness that we share the same human condition. And this is where philosophy helps us see just how deep this teaching goes. Centuries later, Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest philosophers of the Enlightenment, created what he called the categorical imperative, a rule that, at its core, echoes the logic of loving your neighbor. For Kant, an action is only truly moral if the principle behind it can be applied to everyone. In his words, act only according to a rule that you could want to become a universal law. Notice how this connects directly to the golden rule taught by Jesus. Do to others what you would have them do to you. Both ideas, even though they come from different places, the faith of a Jewish carpenter and the reasoning of a Prussian philosopher, meet at the same point. Real ethics are built on reciprocity, justice, and the equal worth of every human being. But there's a key difference. Kant grounds morality in reason. Jesus grounds it in love. For Kant, loving your neighbor is a rational duty. For Jesus, it's a willing offering of the heart, not because logic demands it, but because compassion transforms you. And in the world where Jesus preached, Palestine under a violent empire, with a society divided by class, ethnicity, religion, and money, his message was even more disruptive. Saying your neighbor must be loved as yourself didn't just mean caring about the person next door or helping a friend. It meant loving the despised Samaritan, the excluded leper, the hated tax collector, the condemned woman caught in adultery. Here, love isn't just a feeling, it's action, choice, an ethical stance. Loving your neighbor isn't just being nice, it's breaking through the invisible walls of indifference. It's getting involved, it's taking responsibility, and that takes courage. 2,000 years later, we still struggle to understand this, let alone practice it. We live in a world of extreme individualism, where other people are often seen as competition, a threat, or worse, someone disposable. Social media, ideological bubbles, and growing inequality can make love your neighbor sound distant, almost unrealistic. But that's exactly why the lesson still matters. Because it's not just a moral reminder, it's an urgent call. In times of war, climate crisis, and intolerance, Jesus' proposal remains one of the deepest and most demanding answers. There is no real transformation without an ethical and universal kind of love. Who is my neighbor? That was the question a Pharisee asked Jesus after hearing this command. Who is my neighbor? Luke 10:29. Jesus answered by telling the parable of the Good Samaritan, someone outside the official religion, socially despised, yet the only one who stopped to help a man beaten on the road. That story flips the logic of that time, and maybe ours too. Your neighbor isn't just the person close to you. Your neighbor is the person who needs you, even if they think differently, even if they belong to another culture, another faith, or the other side of the conflict. This kind of love is demanding, because it doesn't pick and choose. It crosses borders. It doesn't require similarity to exist. And in that sense, it's one of the most revolutionary ways a person can live, and one of the most transformative. Love as duty, or love as grace. Philosophy naturally asks, can love be a duty? Kant would say yes, at least in part. For him, we should act out of duty, not just out of emotion. So loving your neighbor becomes a rational decision to respect the other person as an end in themselves, not as a tool. It's a powerful ethical view, but it can feel cold to many hearts. Jesus, on the other hand, doesn't just say, obey this command. He lives it through his actions, words, and relationships. He touches the untouchable, eats with the excluded, forgives the unforgivable. And that shows something beyond reason. The love he teaches isn't calculated, it's freely given. It's a love that offers itself, even with no guarantee of anything in return. When love is hardest, it's easy to love the people who love us back. The hard part is loving your neighbor when they hurt you, betray you, or disappoint you. And that's where Jesus' teaching reaches its highest ethical level. Love isn't an automatic reaction. It's a conscious commitment to the good of the other person, even when it costs you something. That doesn't mean tolerating abuse or accepting injustice. It means refusing to answer hate with hate and refusing to let the other person control your moral standards. It turns victims into people with agency and enemies into possible brothers. Is love a political practice? Yes. Loving your neighbor, while deeply personal, also has social and political consequences. If a society truly takes love of neighbor as its guiding principle, it can't accept poverty next to obscene wealth, or institutional racism, or neglect of the vulnerable. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, rooted his entire civil rights struggle in the ethics of Christian love. Love is the most durable force in the world. It is the only thing that can transform an enemy into a friend. That's the greatness of loving your neighbor as the highest law. It doesn't settle for personal kindness. It dreams of collective justice. What if everyone lived this way? Imagine a generation that took this seriously. A generation that, before every choice, asked, does this decision honor the value of the other person the same way it honors mine? A generation that saw other people not as obstacles, but as an extension of human dignity. A generation that practiced care, not as a burden, but as an expression of the highest form of humanity. It wouldn't be a perfect world, but it would. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Matthew 5:44. There are teachings that comfort us, others confront us. This is one of the second kind. Jesus' call to love not only the people who love us, but also our enemies, is probably one of the most unsettling, difficult, and powerful ideas in the entire history of ethics. It goes against our instinct to defend ourselves, our logic of payback justice, and our impulse to strike back. This is not a pretty sentence to quote in peaceful moments. It's a principle that radically challenges the human heart, and that's exactly why it has the power to transform the world. Loving your enemies is not just about not hating them. It's not about ignoring them. It is to love them, which demands a proactive choice of care, compassion, and many times, sacrifice. Jesus did not say this in an idealized setting. He was speaking to an oppressed people, living under Roman rule, seeing soldiers marching in the streets, abusive taxes being collected, and religious leaders compromised by power. Talking about loving the enemy in that situation was not only countercultural, but even dangerous. But that's exactly where the depth of this teaching is. It doesn't stay in what is easy. It points to what is necessary. The cycle of violence, reaction, or a break. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, while studying the great traumas of the 20th century, especially totalitarianism, the Holocaust, and political violence, came to the conclusion that the only way to break the endless cycle of revenge and resentment is forgiveness. For her, forgiveness is not weakness, but an active force that frees us from the past and makes a new beginning possible. In her book The Human Condition, Arendt writes, Forgiveness is the response to the unpredictability of human action, and without it, there would be no possibility of lasting human relationships. The connection to Jesus' teaching is direct. When Jesus says, "Pray for those who persecute you," he is not asking for passivity in the face of evil, but rather for a response that breaks the logic of retaliation, a response that does not give hate back for hate. This is the same principle Arendt recognizes as essential, so that societies do not remain trapped in trauma, bitterness, and mutual destruction. One of the biggest misunderstandings about forgiveness is thinking it means minimizing the pain we suffered or pretending the evil did not happen. Nothing could be further from the truth. Both Jesus and Arendt make it clear, each in their own way, that forgiving is an act of deep awareness. It recognizes how serious the offense is, but refuses to be defined by it. Jesus, while being unjustly crucified, does not respond with hatred. His final words are, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23:34. There is no denial of suffering here, but a conscious decision not to keep the violence going. Forgiveness, in this case, is an act of inner freedom and unconditional love. Arendt, in turn, says forgiveness is the only act that can truly interrupt the chain of irreversible consequences that come from a wrong that was committed. It offers a chance to start over, not because the other person deserves it, but because we decide not to carry the weight of bitterness anymore. Throughout history, we have seen the power of this principle in action. One remarkable example is Nelson Mandela, who after spending 27 years in prison for fighting apartheid, chose not revenge, but national reconciliation. He said, "As I walked out the gate of the prison, I knew that if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I would still be in prison." Another example is activist Immaculée Ilibagiza, a survivor of the genocide in Rwanda, who saw almost her entire family murdered. Years later, she forgave the killers. Her story, deeply Christian, shows how radical forgiveness can be a way of rebuilding the soul itself. These are not examples of weakness, but of deep moral strength. They show that forgiveness and loving your enemies are not religious illusions, but practical tools for personal and social healing. Loving your enemies does not mean giving up on justice. Jesus did not erase moral responsibility, and he did not ask his followers to accept abuse passively, but he clearly separated justice from revenge and self-defense from destruction. This teaching reminds us that there is a way to fight evil without becoming evil, to protect ourselves without losing our humanity, to resist an oppressor without adopting the oppressor's logic. That's why movements like Gandhi's and Martin Luther King Jr.'s drew directly from this source. Active nonviolence is not the absence of action. It is resistance with dignity. Many people wait for the other person to apologize or change before offering love. But Jesus flips that logic. He says, "Love and pray for them." Even without a request, even without repentance. That kind of love, when it is real, does not depend on the other person's attitude, but on the decision of the one who loves. It is a force that comes from within. It is an act of courage that says, "You can hurt me, but you won't take away my ability to love." Here is the most radical part of the teaching, not giving the enemy the power to dehumanize us. To keep loving is to protect our own essence, even in the face of injustice. Why is this still relevant today? We live in a time of growing polarization. Social media amplifies hate. Ideological differences turn into walls, and any disagreement starts to feel like a reason for contempt. People talk about canceling as if it's normal, and about enemies as if they are less human. It is in this world that Jesus' call still echoes with urgency. Love, pray, forgive. These words are not an escape from reality, but a higher ethical proposal. A harder path, yes, but a higher one. You cannot build bridges with stones in your hands. What Jesus proposes is not a distant utopia, but an inner revolution, a shift from revenge to mercy, from resentment to compassion. And that revolution begins inside each one of us. Loving your enemies is often a process. It takes time, it requires healing, strength, and above all, humility. But that's exactly why it is so transformative, because it frees us from the past, from hate, from the weight of carrying wounds that poison us on the inside. Love for enemies is not only an individual principle, it is a seed of true peace in homes, in schools, in the streets, in politics. When we choose love where hate was expected, we break the logic of war. When we choose forgiveness where revenge made sense, we redefine what is possible. And that is the greatness of this teaching. It is not only ethical, it is prophetic. It points toward a world that does not fully exist yet, but that can already begin in us. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5:3. This line, which opens the famous Sermon on the Mount, is not just a heavenly greeting. It's a declaration of war against the logic of power. In a world where the strong win, the rich pile up wealth, and the influential give the orders, Jesus does the unthinkable. He puts the weak, the broken, the marginalized at the center of God's kingdom. Not as an exception, but as the rule. Not as victims, but as the rightful heirs of the divine promise. Of course, this teaching has spiritual impact, but it also carries a philosophical and ethical force that shakes any system built on domination, hierarchy, and exclusion. And few people understood this more deeply in the 20th century than Simone Weil, one of the most original and radical thinkers in modern philosophy. What does poor in spirit mean? A lot of people interpret this expression as simple humility, but Jesus is going further. The word used in the original Greek for poor here is tokos, which literally means someone completely broken, with nothing, dependent on the mercy of others. Jesus is not praising pride disguised as simplicity. He is saying that the ones who know they have nothing except their own fragility are first in the kingdom of God. It's a view that confronts every form of spiritual, economic, or moral self-sufficiency. In the world, the poor in spirit are thrown away, forgotten, invisible. In Jesus' kingdom, they are blessed. And that changes everything. French philosopher Simone Weil lived a short life, but an intense one. A factory worker, activist, mystic, and thinker, she saw in Jesus a radical break with the logic of force. In her book Gravity and Grace, she writes, "Christ is the one who goes down to the very lowest point of the human condition. He is present where the world sees no value." Weil believed God is revealed not in the shine of glory, but in hidden suffering, in the silence of those who cry alone, in those who have no voice. In a society obsessed with efficiency and performance, she argued that real value shows up when someone looks at another person not as a tool, but as something sacred, and that only becomes possible when we learn to see beauty in the weak. For Simone Weil, the experience of abandonment is where God shows himself most intensely, and that's why she saw Jesus as the model of paying true attention to others, especially to those the world looks down on. Throughout his life and teachings, Jesus breaks the rules of social hierarchy one by one. He eats with sinners, touches lepers, speaks with women ignored by the culture of his time, praises the faith of foreigners, heals on forbidden days, and confronts religious leaders who put the law above compassion. None of this was random. Every act of Jesus was a symbolic and real statement. In the kingdom, he announces, the people the world says have no value are the first ones to be called by name. And this isn't only spiritual, it's deeply political. In a world that pushes people to the margins because of poverty, disability, ethnicity, gender, or social status, Jesus shows that God's love does not respect social walls. It crosses all of them. What's the point of admiring Jesus for valuing the marginalized if we keep building systems that ignore them or exploit them? The message of the gospel is not meant to comfort the poor so they will accept misery. It is a prophetic cry for justice. It exposes the structures that produce poverty, exclusion, racism, and inequality. Today's poor in spirit could be the invisible single mother waiting in a public hospital line, the kid from the outskirts with no chance to study, the refugee nobody wants to take in, the abandoned elderly person, the homeless person we pretend not to see. Jesus is saying the kingdom of heaven belongs to them, and that should make us seriously rethink who we value and why. Simone Weil believed thinking was not enough. For her, philosophy without compassion is just vanity. That's why she left academic life and went to work in factories, to feel in her own body what marginalized people lived through. She volunteered during the war even while sick. And she wrote that real spirituality requires radical attention to the suffering of others, even when we can't fix it, because that attention itself is already an act of love. That kind of ethics isn't found only in books. It is born from meeting real human pain. It means looking into the eyes of someone who suffers without turning away, without judging, without throwing out easy phrases, just presence and care, the way Jesus did. It's important to remember, Jesus does not say, they will be comforted someday. He says, theirs is the kingdom of heaven, right now. That means God's kingdom is already showing up in the restored dignity of the despised, in the divine presence among the people nobody notices. That demands a change in us. It's not just about helping the poor, it's recognizing that they are teachers, signs of the kingdom, living images of grace. It's listening to their stories, walking with them, learning from them. They are not below, they are at the center of the promise. In many places, Jesus' message has been tamed, turned into comfort for the comfortable, a blessing for people who already have plenty, and an excuse to stay uninvolved. But the true gospel keeps crying out in the streets, in alleys, in poor neighborhoods, in refugee camps. The last will be first. Simone Weil strongly criticized any religion that seeks power. For her, God is outside the palaces and inside the pain people don't see. That's why following Jesus is not climbing stairs to glory. It's going down, the way he went down, to the places nobody else wants to go. What if it's in meeting the excluded that we discover the true meaning of life? Jesus seems to say exactly that. He identifies himself with the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, and the imprisoned. Whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did for me. Matthew 25:40. That's not just a figure of speech, it's a new way of understanding dignity. The other person, even in their most vulnerable condition, is sacred because God lives there. The value of the marginalized is not an idea to admire, but a challenge to live. It means changing our way of seeing, our priorities, our emotions. It means calling out injustice, listening to those who have been silenced, and taking a stand with courage wherever it's needed. Jesus didn't romanticize poverty, but he revealed its power as a so in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. Matthew 7:12. The so-called golden rule is, at the same time, simple and deeply demanding. Jesus presents it as the essence of the law and the prophets. In other words, a summary of Israel's entire religious and moral tradition. But its importance goes far beyond the biblical context. It crosses cultures, centuries, and philosophies, echoing, for example, in the teachings of the Chinese sage Confucius, who lived centuries before Jesus and already said, "Do not do to others what you do not want done to you." Even though they sound similar, there's a subtle but deep difference between Confucius's version and the Christian version. Confucius proposes an ethic of non-aggression, a passive principle, avoid causing harm. Jesus, on the other hand, proposes an ethic of conscious, caring action, an active principle, do the good you would want to receive. And that difference says a lot about the kind of ethical transformation Jesus is calling his followers to live out. No matter the time, place, or culture, the Golden Rule shows up, with variations, in some of the oldest religious and philosophical traditions in the world. In Hinduism, in Vedic texts, in Buddhism, in Islam, in Judaism, and in Greco-Roman philosophies, there is always some kind of appeal to moral reciprocity. But what Jesus does is place this rule at the center of moral life, not as an optional ideal, but as the highest standard for what is right. He is basically saying, want to know if your attitude is right? Ask yourself, would you want this done to you? It sounds simple, But that question holds enormous power for self-criticism because it forces us to step out of our own center. It pushes us to honestly consider the other person's point of view, and that can shake even our most common habits. Confucius's negative ethic, do not do, would already be enough to improve a lot of human behavior. Avoiding what we wouldn't want to suffer already prevents injustice, cruelty, and abuse. But Jesus goes further. He isn't satisfied with the absence of evil. He demands the presence of good. It's much easier to say, I don't steal, or I don't hurt people, than to ask, what would I want someone to do for me if I were suffering? That question pulls us out of comfortable neutrality. It requires active empathy. And that's where Jesus' ethics shows itself to be more demanding than any legal system. What would you do for yourself if you were alone, sick, treated unfairly? Then do that for someone else, now, without expecting anything in return. Imagine if this way of thinking guided the small actions of everyday life, on the road, at work, at school, on social media. Think about the impact if before every comment, every decision, every judgment, we honestly asked, would I want to be treated like this? It calls us to be intentional in how we care for others. It's not enough not to hurt people. We have to build relationships based on justice, generosity, and understanding. And this can start with simple gestures, listening closely, apologizing, helping without being asked, not exposing someone else's mistakes, protecting the vulnerable, giving a voice to those who don't have one. Following the golden rule isn't automatic. It requires moral imagination because it forces us to step out of our position and put ourselves in the other person's place, something that takes effort, humility, and sensitivity. Philosopher Martha Nussbaum, even though she doesn't speak directly about the golden rule, talks about the importance of empathetic imagination as a foundation for justice. For her, fair societies are built by citizens who can actually feel with others, and that only happens when we learn to see another person's humanity with the same eyes we see our own. That idea fits perfectly with Jesus' teaching. There is no justice without recognizing the other, without the willingness to see in another person someone just as worthy as we are. It's easy to apply the golden rule when we're dealing with friends, but the real test comes when the other person bothers us, challenges us, or threatens us. Then the question becomes uncomfortable. Am I willing to treat someone well, even if they may not treat me the same way? Jesus doesn't make reciprocity a condition. He doesn't say, do good to others as long as they do good to you too. He says, do it. Period. Because ethics doesn't depend on payback. It depends on the conscience of who we are and on who the other person is. This is where the golden rule becomes a mirror. It shows us where we're still trapped in disguised selfishness, where we're kind while expecting something back, where we help, but with pride, where we're polite, but only out of interest. This logic can, and should, also be applied to bigger structures, companies, governments, institutions. What would politics look like if leaders treated the people the way they would want to be treated? What would the prison system look like if we applied this rule to those who are convicted? What about education, if every teacher looked at students with the same respect they would want their own children to receive? The golden rule, if taken seriously, transforms any system, because it isn't satisfied with efficiency. It demands humanity. It asks us to make the other person the standard for every decision. Today, with technology, globalization, and the speed of information, we often feel like the world has gotten smaller. But ironically, it also seems like people have become more distant from each other. Polarization grows, dialogue disappears, and individualism hides behind the word freedom. In that context, the golden rule shines like an ethical compass. It helps us remember we are not islands, that other people are not obstacles, but an essential part of what makes us fully human. It also points to the kind of future we want to build, a future based on reciprocity, solidarity, and mutual respect. A future where we don't need laws forcing people to love, because ethics is already written in each person's heart. The golden rule isn't a theory meant to live only in books or sermons. It's a daily practice. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead people's bones and all kinds of filth. Matthew 23:27. There's no way to soften this. Jesus is outraged. And his outrage isn't aimed at criminals, ordinary sinners, or even the oppressive Romans. It's aimed at the religious leaders of his time, especially the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, who used the law as a tool for control, oppression, and spiritual self-promotion. To Jesus, they represent the worst kind of distortion of faith, something that looks holy on the outside, but hides arrogance, vanity, and indifference on the inside. This warning has lasted through the centuries because religious legalism and moral hypocrisy aren't only problems of the past. They reinvent themselves in every generation, in every culture, always wearing the same mask, the appearance of righteousness, but the absence of compassion. That's why Jesus' critique still feels so current and so uncomfortable. Legalism is the idea that following rules is what makes a person right before God or society. It replaces a living conscience with blind repetition. In Jesus' time, it showed up as detailed rules about purity, tithing, fasting, Sabbath behavior, and religious rituals, often enforced without mercy, especially against the poor, the sick, and the marginalized. Jesus breaks that pattern. He heals on the Sabbath, touches lepers, eats with sinners, and allows his disciples to do what the Pharisees considered violations. Not because he despised the law, but because he saw it as a means, not an end. As he said, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Mark 2:27. The critique here is deep. Any rule that loses love as its center becomes unjust, even if it looks correct. Legalism suffocates life and paralyzes ethics. It turns faith into a prison and spirituality into a performance. The word hypocrite comes from the Greek hypocrites, a term used for stage actors, people who play a role. When Jesus calls the Pharisees hypocrites, that's exactly what he means. They perform a religious role, but their lives don't match what they preach. They look devoted on the outside, but they are cold on the inside. They are strict with others, but lenient with themselves. That's why Jesus compares them to whitewashed tombs, clean on the outside, rotten on the inside. Their spirituality is about appearance, not ethics. It's a display window, not a calling. And that double life may be what most distorts the meaning of what is sacred. Today, that same hypocrisy shows up in many forms. Religious leaders who preach purity while living in corruption. People who condemn others' behavior while hiding their own failures. Speeches about love that lead to exclusion. Jesus' critique isn't only aimed at Pharisees from 2,000 years ago. It's aimed at all of us whenever we use morality as a shield for our ego. Interestingly, one of the sharpest critics of institutional religion was Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher who, even though he was an atheist, showed a strange, paradoxical respect for Jesus. For Nietzsche, what corrupted Jesus' original message was the transformation of living faith into a slave morality, a religion of resentment, guilt, and blind obedience. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche writes, Jesus died too early. He did not yet know the world. The Pharisees defeated him. Jesus would have been a free spirit, without church, without institution, without law. Nietzsche sees Jesus as a liberating spirit, someone who lived beyond rules, who embodied love as a creative force, without submitting to what Nietzsche saw as the decaying morality of the teachers of the law. For him, the real tragedy wasn't Jesus' death, but what people did to his message afterward. They turned it into a dogmatic, repressive system against the very freedom Jesus embodied. So Nietzsche doesn't reject Jesus. He rejects the Christianity that trapped Jesus' message under layers of guilt, legalism, and hypocrisy. In a way, he echoes Jesus himself, who fiercely opposed religious leaders who used morality to oppress in God's name. Legalism has one central problem. It separates action from intention. It measures people by their outward performance without considering their inner humanity. And that produces a kind of morality that punishes but doesn't welcome, that points out wrongdoing but doesn't reach out a hand. Jesus does the opposite. He moves toward broken people. He sees beyond sin. He sees the human being. Where legalism sees an adulteress, he sees a woman. Where hypocrisy sees a sinner, he sees a lost child. That is the ethic of the gospel. A justice that restores, not one that condemns. A truth that frees, not one that humiliates. And because of that, it's a spirituality that shocks moralists. Legalism has always had, and still has, a tempting appeal. It offers security. Clear rules, sharp lines between right and wrong, a system that tells you who is in and who is out. But that security comes at the cost of life. Jesus disrupts that system. He walks with the people who don't fit in. He refuses to answer the traps set by legalists. He strips authority from those who use God to control others. And that's exactly what makes him so dangerous and so liberating, because he calls us to a faith that doesn't hide behind rules, but commits to inner truth. And that kind of faith can't be controlled by institutions. Jesus' critique of hypocrisy is not a call to perfectionism, but to integrity. He doesn't demand people without mistakes. He demands authentic people. People who don't use religion as a shield, but as a mirror. People who don't pretend, but live. The spirituality Jesus offers is built on lived truth, not maintained appearances. It is humble enough to admit failure, but strong enough to pursue justice. It's a spirituality that doesn't judge others, because it is always examining itself first. In our time, when faith is often mixed with political power, when religion is used to justify prejudice, exclusion and privilege, Jesus' cry still echoes, "Woe to you, hypocrites!" Not as blind condemnation, but as a wake-up call. He's saying, tear off the masks, give faith back its humanity, stop using God's name to defend personal interests. This critique is necessary and urgent, because whenever religion becomes a show, the sacred pulls away. And whenever morality becomes control, grace disappears. Jesus didn't come to build a moral system. He came to announce freedom. Freedom that doesn't deny ethics, but roots ethics in love, not in obligation. Even Nietzsche, with his hostility toward religion, understood that Jesus was a free spirit, a man who refused the chains of the system in order to live the fullness of being. Jesus didn't write philosophical treatises. He didn't build a school like the Greek academies. And yet, his actions and words shape a deep ethic, one that can radically change the way we see the human being. In a time marked by social divisions, rituals of exclusion, and prejudice based on race, gender, and illness, he walks among the marginalized, not only to comfort them, but to restore their dignity. His gestures speak loudly. He touches lepers who were seen as unclean and untouchable. He speaks with women in a society that silenced them. And more than that, he speaks with Samaritans, a people hated by many Jews at the time, breaking religious and social boundaries with courage and empathy. Jesus doesn't just teach dignity, he gives it through his presence. Centuries later, Christian philosophers like Boethius and Thomas Aquinas tried to put into philosophical language what Jesus had lived out in practice. The idea that every human being has dignity, not because of what they do, but because of what they are. For Boethius, the definition of a person is this: an individual substance of a rational nature. That definition, simple at first glance, hides a powerful principle. Reason and individuality make each person unique and valuable. It's not about status, appearance, or skills, but about essence. Thomas Aquinas expands this view by bringing together philosophical reasoning and Christian faith. For him, human dignity is rooted in the idea that each person is created in the image and likeness of God, imago Dei. And because of that, every human life has absolute value, no matter their condition. This teaching became fundamental in shaping Western ethical thought, influencing everything from modern human rights to the social teaching of the Church. But before it was theory, it was practice, in Jesus' concrete actions. Jesus lived in a deeply unequal world. There were strict separations between men and women, Jews and foreigners, clean and unclean, rich and poor. And the unclean were thrown away, not only socially, but spiritually as well. Jesus challenges that with quietly revolutionary actions. When he speaks with the Samaritan woman at the well, John 4, he breaks two barriers at once: gender and ethnicity. And he does it without talking down to her, but with real respect and attentive listening. When he touches the leper, Mark 1:41, he confronts a religious system of exclusion that treated touch as contamination. For Jesus, the real contamination isn't on the skin, but in indifference, and the act of touching becomes a way of giving human worth back. And when he protects the woman caught in adultery, John 8, threatened with being stoned, he doesn't only save her life. He exposes the hypocrisy of a morality that punishes selectively. His words, "Let the one who is without sin cast the first stone," are a call to a universal awareness of imperfection, and therefore to universal compassion. These aren't isolated acts of mercy, they are ethical statements. They declare that before God, no one is disposable. Everyone carries within them a spark of the divine, and that is enough for them to deserve respect. What Jesus reveals, and what Boethius and Thomas reinforce, is that dignity is not something you earn. It is intrinsic. It doesn't depend on status, wealth, religion, origin, or behavior. It's an ontological reality. A human being has value simply because they are human. And that clashes with how the world usually treats people. We live inside a merit-based logic where someone's worth is measured by productivity, appearance, usefulness, or success. Anyone who doesn't fit the standard is easily ignored. But Jesus moves in the opposite direction. He goes toward the useless in the eyes of the world. And there he finds the true beauty of humanity. Sadly, this vision did not dominate the structures of power throughout history. Human dignity has been, and still is, denied in many ways. Slavery, racism, sexism, xenophobia, inequality, exploitation. For centuries, voices and bodies have been silenced by systems that keep treating human beings like disposable objects. In the modern era, Nazi concentration camps, for example, represented the total collapse of human dignity, turning people into numbers, targets, waste. And even in times of peace, millions of people live in inhuman conditions, as if their existence mattered less. Jesus stands against that entire story. He doesn't only denounce injustice, he puts the human being back at the center of what is sacred. He sees value where the world sees leftovers, and that is one of the greatest ethical revolutions in history. Boethius wrote his most famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy, while imprisoned and sentenced to death. There, even in the face of injustice, he affirms the greatness of the human soul. It's as if he's saying, "No one can take from me what makes me a person." Thomas Aquinas, centuries later, would expand this idea, saying that even the greatest sinner still has inviolable dignity, because the evil a person does not destroy the good they are in their deepest essence. That statement has extraordinary power, especially in times of cancel culture, relentless punishment, and merciless exclusion. Dignity, in the Christian philosophical view, cannot be destroyed, even if it is hidden. And because of that, everyone deserves to be treated with respect, even, or especially, those who have failed. Recognizing another person's dignity isn't just an idea, it's a call to action. It means defending the rights of the vulnerable, protecting the forgotten, welcoming those who are different, healing the wounded. Contemporary philosopher Paul Ricoeur wrote that human dignity requires mutual recognition. In other words, it's often in the eyes of another person that our own existence is confirmed. And when we deny that gaze to someone through contempt, invisibility, or indifference, we also deny our own humanity. Jesus recognized people. He saw them, he came close, and that saved lives. Today, more than ever, we live in a crisis of presence. People are surrounded by technology, but starving for real connection. There are abandoned elderly people, isolated people with disabilities, invisible children, exploited workers. Restoring human dignity, in the light of Jesus, Boethius, and Thomas Aquinas, is more than charity. It is justice. It's being with people. It's listening. It's making sure no one feels unnecessary. It's not just treating someone well. It's recognizing in the other person the same divine spark that lives in us. That changes how we deal with politics, economics, and education. And it also changes small everyday actions. How we look at the grocery store cashier, the janitor, the stranger on the subway. Jesus taught that when we look into another person's eyes, especially someone who is suffering, we see the face of God. That's what makes every life sacred. That's what grounds a truly universal ethic. There is no hierarchy of value between people. There are no lives that matter more than others. The challenge is to live this with courage. The kingdom of God is among you. Luke 17:21. There's a recurring hope throughout human history, the dream of an ideal kingdom, a place where there is justice, peace, truth, and compassion. But we usually project that ideal outside of ourselves, onto governments, leaders, systems, and utopias that always seem far away. Then Jesus shows up and says, with a disarming simplicity, "The kingdom of God does not come with outward appearance. The kingdom of God is among you." That sentence carries a quiet revolution that escapes the logic of power. Jesus refuses thrones, armies, political schemes, and battles for authority. Unlike the messianic hopes of his time, hopes for a military liberator who would crush Rome, he begins an ethical kingdom, not a territorial one, an inner kingdom, not an institutional one, a present kingdom, not some distant future. This vision was deeply understood by Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian writer and spiritual thinker. In his book, The Kingdom of God is Within You, 1894, Tolstoy argues that Jesus did not come to found an institutional religion or a theocratic state. He came to propose a new way of living, based on love, non-violence, truth, and inner justice. For Tolstoy, the mistake of institutionalized Christianity was interpreting the kingdom as something external, when Jesus clearly pointed to a revolution that begins in the heart of each person. And this revolution is ethical because it changes how the individual relates to the world, to others, and to themselves. The kingdom of God is not a place, but a state of mind, Tolstoy would say. It begins when we abandon lies, violence, and hate, and choose truth, love, and justice. Jesus' kingdom has no palaces, no centers of power, and no armies to defend it. It doesn't enforce laws through coercion. Instead, it offers principles for life that require awareness, freedom, and moral courage. It's a kingdom where the last are first, where the servant is greatest, where loving your enemies is the law, and where forgiving matters more than winning. This kingdom is radically subversive because it destroys hierarchies built on strength, wealth, and fame, and replaces them with invisible values: humility, mercy, truth, and service. Jesus didn't offer a new political organization, he offered a new humanity. And that proposal is still revolutionary in any era, precisely because it doesn't depend on systems, but on people willing to live differently. Tolstoy saw in Jesus' proposal the only real answer to violence and human suffering. For him, it's not a change of regime that saves the world, but a change of character. He believed every external revolution, without an internal revolution, fails. History confirms this. Political revolutions that promise justice often end up repeating the same mistakes as the regimes they overthrow. Why? Because without ethics, all power becomes corrupted. The kingdom of God, according to Jesus and Tolstoy, isn't built with decrees, but with actions. Not with flags, but with daily choices. It shows up every time someone chooses forgiveness instead of revenge, truth instead of lies, the common good instead of selfishness. Is the kingdom already among us? When Jesus says the kingdom is among us, he breaks the idea that absolute good is always in the future. Good is already available now, whenever someone lives according to the Father's will. That means the kingdom is not a promise for after death. It's a reality that can be born here, in this broken world. That doesn't mean denying suffering or injustice. It means the kingdom of God doesn't wait for perfect circumstances to appear. It begins in the middle of chaos. Jesus was born in a manger, lived among the poor, was hunted and executed, and still said the kingdom had arrived. That teaches us something crucial. Ethics are not controlled by the environment. The kingdom's revolution happens precisely when everything seems against it. The world often pushes a logic of competition, self-promotion, and power. Jesus' proposal goes the opposite way. Win through love, resist with gentleness, transform through truth. This ethic is a deep form of resistance, not a passive one. Jesus resisted Rome's power, the Pharisees' legalism, and the indifference of the elite of his time, without using violence. He stayed faithful to the end, to an ethical revolution that doesn't force itself through power, but disarms the other person's heart. Tolstoy was deeply shaped by this. His commitment to non-violence influenced Gandhi, who built his entire philosophy of peaceful resistance on the principles of the Sermon on the Mount. Later, Martin Luther King Jr. would do the same. And so we see how the kingdom's ethical proposal did not stay trapped on the page. It became historical practice. One of the great ironies of history is that the religion born from Jesus' teaching often partnered with the very power he criticized. Churches allied with empires, crusades, inquisitions, persecutions. All of that is the opposite of the kingdom of God described by Jesus. Tolstoy condemned this contradiction fiercely. He said institutional Christianity betrayed Christ by seeking domination instead of serving. For him, the true follower of Jesus is the one who lives the way Jesus lived, even if that means swimming against the current. So the kingdom is not owned by any church, any government, or any ideology. It belongs to those who live with justice, love, and truth, even in silence. The kingdom of God doesn't begin with big events. It begins in what's invisible, in personal decisions that others may never notice. Not lying when it would be easier, forgiving when everything in us screams for revenge, loving someone who doesn't deserve it, acting with integrity when no one is watching. Those acts don't make headlines, but they change the world from the inside out. The kingdom is not a takeover of power. It is the recognition that love is the most real and transforming force that exists. And that's exactly why this kingdom is eternal. No empire can destroy it. No prison can contain it. Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all. Mark 9:35. In any society, the top is the most desired place to be, the first, the most admired, the most followed, the most applauded. Since childhood, we're trained to compete, to win, to chase recognition. But Jesus does the opposite of what people expect. He flips the logic of the social ladder. He says, with a shocking clarity, that anyone who wants to be the greatest must become a servant, not to a few, but to everyone. This statement isn't symbolic, it's radical, because it proposes a completely new way to understand what greatness is. In Jesus' view, real strength isn't found in control, but in humility. And humility isn't blind submission or forced self-lowering. It's a conscious choice to put the other person at the center of your ethics. That's also what philosopher Emmanuel Levinas talks about when he says, ethics begins with responsibility for the other, and that responsibility naturally grows out of humility. The word humility comes from the Latin humus, meaning fertile soil, ground, foundation. So being humble doesn't mean erasing yourself. It means recognizing that we are human, finite, limited, and at the same time valuable because of that. It means keeping your feet on the ground without placing yourself above anyone. Jesus lived this humility in a real, embodied way. He didn't only talk about serving, he served. He washed his disciples' feet. He ate with the excluded. He refused to be crowned king. He died among criminals. At every moment, he chose the path of self-giving instead of self-promotion. He was not weak, but he chose not to use his strength to dominate. He used it to lift others up. And that's what makes humility a strength. It transforms relationships rebuilds dignity, and creates bridges where pride only builds walls. For Emmanuel Levinas, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, ethics doesn't begin with rules or abstract reasoning. It begins with the face of the other person. When we stand in front of another human being, especially someone fragile, someone in need, someone who is suffering, something wakes up inside us. Responsibility. And that responsibility, he says, comes before any choice. It's the foundation of our humanity. But this ethics of the other can only appear if we are humble, if we are willing to listen, to welcome, to be affected. If we are too busy with our image, our status, our strength, we won't truly see the other person, and then we won't be able to act ethically. So humility isn't a moral accessory, it's the soil where ethics grows. Without it, we become judges, competitors, spectators. With it, we become servants, caretakers, brothers and sisters. Jesus' message becomes even more provocative when we remember the historical context. The Roman Empire ruled through violence and pride. Religious leaders valued status, titles, and appearances. The disciples, shaped by that culture, argued among themselves about who would be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And in that moment, Jesus confronts them. Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all. In other words, the greatness you know is corrupted. I'm going to show you a different way. He doesn't condemn the desire to be great. He redefines what greatness is. True greatness, according to Jesus, isn't measured by how many followers you have, but by how many people you lift up with your hands. It isn't about who serves you, but who you choose to serve. A common mistake when talking about humility is confusing it with blind submission or self-devaluation. But Christian humility isn't passivity. It's choice. It's decision. It's a kind of courage that doesn't need to shout because it knows its place, and the other person's place too. Serving doesn't mean saying yes to everything. It means saying yes to what builds. It means not putting your ego above compassion. It means recognizing the other person has value too, and that my life only makes sense in relationship to that other person. Jesus served, but he never stayed silent in the face of injustice. He washed the disciples' feet, but he confronted the Pharisees with courage. That shows humility and strength don't cancel each other out. They actually complete each other. Talking about humility can sound poetic, but it shows up in the most concrete, difficult situations. When we apologize, when we admit we were wrong, when we listen to someone we disagree with, when we recognize we don't know everything, when we let go of the need to be right in order to protect a relationship. It also shows up when we could humiliate someone, but we choose to lift them up instead. When we have power and we use it to protect, not to control. Those gestures aren't weakness. They are refined strength, the strength of someone who doesn't need to prove anything because they know who they are. The opposite of humility isn't strength. It's empty pride. The illusion that we're superior, that we can live without others, that we don't make mistakes. That kind of pride isolates, hardens, and pushes people away. It's interesting how the most arrogant people are often, deep down, the most insecure because they need constant approval, applause, position. Truly humble people live with more lightness because they aren't trapped by their own image. When Jesus says the greatest is the servant, he frees us from that weight. He's basically saying, you don't have to be the center, and that's a good thing. Humility as an ethical revolution. Levinas understood that facing the other person forces us to step outside ourselves, and that stepping outside is always an act of humility, because it unsettles us, pulls us out of the comfort of the ego, and invites us to take responsibility, even without guilt, even without getting anything back. That is revolutionary, because the world trains us to care only about ourselves. But Levinas's ethics, like Jesus's ethics, trains us to care for the other, and to discover, in that care, the deepest meaning of existence. Today, more than ever, the world needs humble leaders, in every area, Families, businesses, governments, churches. People who don't use power to elevate themselves, but to build bridges, heal wounds, and restore what was broken. Humility, in that sense, isn't the absence of leadership. It's the highest form of leadership, because it listens, it learns, it corrects itself, it shares, and above all, it places other people's well-being above personal pride. Jesus is the greatest example of that. He had all authority, yet he washed feet. He could have demanded obedience, but he chose to inspire through love. That's the kind of leadership that transforms, not by force, but by presence. Humility doesn't chase the spotlight. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other also. Matthew 5:39. Few sentences feel as strange as this one. A lot of people's first reaction is, so, we're supposed to accept violence? We're supposed to be passive in the face of injustice? Not at all. Jesus isn't teaching blind submission. He's proposing a new kind of strength, the strength of active non-violence, a form of resistance that refuses to use the oppressor's weapons, but also refuses to surrender to fear or hatred. This principle is often misunderstood, but it was reinterpreted in a brilliant and practical way by Mahatma Gandhi, who found in Jesus a foundation for his philosophy of life and struggle. Gandhi called this posture satyagraha, the force of truth, a strength that refuses to fight evil with evil, but also refuses to bow down to injustice. Jesus and Gandhi, each in their own way, faced violence without becoming violent, and that posture carries a quiet, ethical revolution, one powerful enough to move mountains. To understand how deep Jesus' words really are, you have to look at the historical context. First-century Palestine was a land occupied by Roman soldiers. There was humiliation, abusive taxation, and institutional violence. Jewish people lived under tension, and many were waiting for a warrior Messiah, someone who would free the people with a sword in hand. But Jesus refuses that path. He doesn't side with complacency, but he rejects the logic of revenge. When he says, "Turn the other cheek," he's teaching that real resistance happens when you break the cycle of violence, when you show the aggressor that they can hurt your body, but they cannot control your dignity. Turning the other cheek is not submission. It's a conscious act of moral freedom. It's saying, through your body and your silence, you don't turn me into your enemy because I choose the path of peace. Centuries later, Mahatma Gandhi would turn this principle into a weapon of political resistance. Leading a liberation movement against the British Empire, he didn't use armies, bombs, or insults. He used fasting, marches, presence, truth, and above all, active non-violence. Gandhi read the Gospels daily, especially the Sermon on the Mount. To him, Jesus was the greatest example of how truth can resist oppressive power without being infected by it. In his words, Christ lived and died in peace, and that made him infinitely more powerful than Caesar with all his legions. For Gandhi, non-violence wasn't weakness. It was the strength of people who refuse to hate, even when they have reasons. It was the courage of someone who suffers but refuses to strike back on the same level. And that takes far more character than revenge. Violence tends to multiply. One aggressive act produces another. And that's how the cycle of vengeance is born. Throughout history, this cycle has destroyed families, communities, entire nations. Jesus knew that. And that's why he teaches a response that interrupts the chain. When someone attacks you and you don't retaliate, but you also don't run away, you expose the other person's violence without becoming like them. That kind of response disarms the aggressor morally and often plants a seed of reflection. This doesn't mean no reaction. On the contrary, it's a reaction that is harder, deeper, and more transformative. Jesus isn't saying to suffer in silence. He's saying to respond in a way that protects your dignity and, at the same time, challenges the aggressor's conscience. Both Jesus and Gandhi showed that non-violence is not neutral. It acts, it confronts, it demands change, but it does so without destroying. And because of that, it builds something that lasts. The strength of non-violence is exactly in its power to awaken conscience, not fear. Fear can silence someone for a while, conscience transforms for real. This is the logic of the kingdom of God. Change the world not by forcing power, but by the presence of justice. And justice is only real when it grows out of love, even if that love is firm, demanding, and willing to expose evil while refusing to fight with the same weapon. In the same Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." That line, together with "turn the other cheek," forms the heart of the ethic of active nonviolence. Loving an enemy doesn't mean approving what they do. It means recognizing they are still human, even when they act like an enemy. And that may be the most radical and most difficult thing a person can do, but it's also the most freeing. Because it prevents us from becoming what we hate. When we respond to violence with violence, we become copies of the oppressor. When we respond with love, even firm love, even painful love, we become free. In today's world, violence takes many forms. It isn't only in wars, but also in words, in social media, in quiet exclusions, in institutionalized contempt. Responding to all of that with hate feels natural. But Jesus and Gandhi remind us there is another path, a harder path, but a stronger one. Active nonviolence. It doesn't ignore injustice, but it also refuses to be corrupted by it. This posture requires discernment. Not every situation allows silence. Sometimes resistance must speak, write, protest, and act with force, but always in a way that protects dignity, both the other person's and our own. Many people confuse nonviolence with passivity or cowardice, but it takes far more courage than retaliation. It requires self-control, clarity of purpose, strength of spirit. It's harder to extend a hand than to make a fist. This courage isn't heroic in a romantic sense. It's daily. It shows up when someone refuses to scream in an argument, when they choose not to humiliate someone who failed, when they face an unjust system with truth, but without hate. It's a courage that sometimes takes hits in silence, but plants peace in ground where there was only violence. History is full of empires that ruled through force and disappeared, but Jesus' message remains. Gandhi defeated an empire without firing a shot. Martin Luther King Jr., inspired by both, confronted racism with words and marches, and changed America. These stories show that nonviolence isn't only a personal virtue, it's a historical force. It transforms because it is built on truth. Because as Gandhi said, truth is God. And whoever acts for truth doesn't need to win immediately. They only need to remain faithful. Because time always favors what is just. Jesus didn't want to change behavior alone. He wanted to change conscience. He knew the world would only change when people learned to love more than hate, to listen more than shout, to turn the other cheek, not as weakness, but as revolution. That is what active nonviolence is, a revolution of conscience, a way of living that doesn't reproduce evil, but confronts it with a light that doesn't go out. And that light stays alive in every person who chooses to answer evil with good, not out of fear, but out of strength, not out of weakness, but out of faithfulness to truth. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. John 8:32. The word freedom is one of the most celebrated ideas in the modern world. It shows up in political slogans, protest chants, self-help speeches, and consumer promises. It has a universal pull. But in the middle of all these versions of the word, we often forget what it really means. For many people, being free means doing whatever you want, whenever you want, however you want. No limits. Total independence. But Jesus offers a different perspective. Real freedom doesn't come from having no restrictions. It comes from knowing the truth. He says there's one essential condition for being free: seeing clearly. And whoever sees the truth deeply, about themselves, about the world, about God, is no longer a slave to illusion, ego, or sin. What Jesus is saying is profound. Truth sets you free because it reveals. It reveals who we really are. It reveals what traps us. It reveals what lies beyond appearances. The freedom he offers isn't just external, it's internal. It is born from an encounter with truth that unsettles us, confronts us, and transforms us. The kind of liberation Jesus talks about doesn't begin in political structures, but in the structure of the soul. Yes, he speaks to people living under an empire, but more than anything, he speaks to people who are trapped on the inside by guilt, fear, pride, and lies. And his promise is clear. The truth will set you free. If you welcome it, if you let it reach the deepest parts of your being. Centuries later, St. Augustine, one of the greatest thinkers in Christianity, went deep into this idea of freedom through his own life story. He was a brilliant young man, hungry for pleasure, fame, and power. He tried many forms of freedom by the world's standards, until he realized that even if he could do anything, he wasn't truly free. He writes in Confessions, "I made my own will into a chain. I thought I was free, but I was a slave to myself." For Augustine, freedom is not the freedom to sin, but freedom from sin. It's not doing whatever you want, it's wanting what is good. And that only becomes possible when the soul turns toward God, the source of truth, goodness, and beauty. That's why he also says, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." In other words, true freedom is not moving away from God, but being united with him. The closer a person gets to the truth that created them, the more they find themselves, and the more they become free from every chain that shrinks them. Many people say they're free, but they're trapped. Trapped by other people's opinions, by the need for approval, by the addiction to comparison. Trapped by anxiety, vanity, the need to control. Trapped by the past, by resentment, by guilt. Sometimes the worst prison has no visible bars, but it shapes every thought, every choice, every reaction. Jesus sees this clearly, and his promise isn't fake. He doesn't promise a life without challenges, but he promises inner freedom. And that is the greatest kind of freedom, because no one can take it away, not governments, not crises, not persecution. Inner freedom is the kind that remains even when everything around us feels out of control. It's the freedom of martyrs, the wise, the humble, the freedom of someone who no longer depends on applause, wealth, or status, because they have found the truth that gives life meaning. For Augustine, the human problem isn't a lack of freedom, it's a disordered will. He says the human will was created good, but it got lost when it chose to love what is lower instead of what is eternal. And here's a key point in his philosophy. Real freedom is only possible when the will is healed and directed toward the good. Sin isn't just breaking a rule, it's turning the will away from its true purpose, God. So conversion isn't a prison, it's liberation. It's the soul being freed from its uncontrolled passions. It's like a compass pointing north again. The soul finds its direction, and freedom becomes the full realization of the good. In the modern world, people often defend a neutral freedom, where anything goes, where there's no right or wrong, only personal choices. But both Jesus and Augustine reject that idea. For them, freedom isn't an end in itself. Freedom is for something greater: love, goodness, truth. Using freedom against those values is, in practice, losing it. A simple example. A person can use their freedom to destroy themselves with drugs, lies, violence. But in the process, they become a slave to what they chose. Misused freedom ends up destroying freedom itself. That's why Jesus' call to truth is also a call to responsibility. Knowing the truth means living it. And living the truth is what sets you free. For Jesus, love is not the opposite of freedom. Love is freedom fully lived, because someone who truly loves doesn't need to be forced to do what is right. They do it by choice, by desire, by a willing gift of themselves. Augustine said, "Love and do what you will." That doesn't mean doing whatever you feel like. It means that someone who truly loves no longer wants evil, so they are free to act without fear. That is the freedom of saints, the wise, the humble. A freedom that is no longer centered on me, but on us. A freedom that seeks the common good, that becomes real in service, that finds joy in giving. not out of obligation, but because love has shaped the will. True freedom also shows itself in the hardest moments, when we suffer, when we're treated unfairly, when we lose something. In those moments, we can't control what happens, but we can still choose how we respond. And that's where inner freedom comes in. The freedom to forgive even when we're hurt, to be grateful even in loss, to hold on to hope even in darkness. This freedom isn't just emotional, it's spiritual, and it may be the most powerful kind of freedom there is. It was this freedom that Jesus lived out in front of the cross. He said, "No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord." John 10:18. Even condemned, he chose to love. Even betrayed, he chose to forgive. Even crucified, he remained free. That is the greatness of inner freedom. It doesn't depend on circumstances. A body can be imprisoned, a mouth can be silenced, but a free spirit, no one can control. This is the freedom that shaped martyrs, prophets, and peacemakers. They lived under oppression, but they were never conquered on the inside, because they knew the truth, and that truth set them free every day. Blessed are those who have not seen, and yet have believed. John 20:29. The scene is well known. Thomas, one of the disciples, says he will only believe in Jesus' resurrection if he can see it with his own eyes and touch it with his own hands. Jesus then appears and meets Thomas's request. But right after that, he speaks a blessing that still echoes today as a call to real faith. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. This isn't praise for being naive, and it isn't a rejection of reason. It's the recognition that faith is more than logical evidence. It's an existential decision. And few people understood that better than Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher who dared to say that having faith means making a leap into paradox, a courageous leap that challenges certainty and leads to the most authentic kind of life. Kierkegaard lived in the 19th century, in a Europe shaped by rational thinking. Philosophy wanted to prove everything, explain everything, organize even God into a system. Against that trend, he pushes back with a provocation. What if the truest life isn't the one with all the answers, but the one that dares to live in the middle of the questions? For him, faith isn't something you prove with arguments the way you prove a math formula. It's a personal and passionate choice in front of something you can't fully understand. He writes, "Faith begins exactly where reason ends. In other words, when you can no longer see with your eyes or touch with your hands, you can still believe. And that belief isn't empty. It's a commitment to the infinite, even while living inside the limits of the finite. It's trust that rises from the heart and steps into the unknown." Kierkegaard uses the image of a leap to describe this act of faith. It's not a normal step. It's a leap because there's a gap between the finite and the infinite, between the human and the divine, between time and eternity. And the bridge that connects those two worlds isn't proof, it's faith. To believe in Jesus as God made flesh, who dies and rises again, is to accept a paradox. It's believing that eternity entered time, that the infinite became human, that absolute truth showed itself in a vulnerable body. Reason hesitates in front of that. But faith, Kierkegaard says, leaps. And what's on the other side of the leap? Not absolute certainty, but a life lived with meaning, courage, and surrender. Because faith, more than an idea, is a way of existing. For Kierkegaard, Jesus is not just the object of faith, he is the model of a life lived before God, a life marked by obedience to an inner calling, even in the face of suffering, loneliness, and misunderstanding. Jesus didn't chase popularity, security, or social approval. He followed the path of truth all the way, even when it led to the cross. And that makes him, for Kierkegaard, the highest example of existential authenticity. So being a Christian isn't repeating doctrinal phrases. It's following Christ's path in its full radical seriousness. It's carrying your own cross, letting go of false security, and living in the tension between what the world praises and what God asks. Life is full of uncertainty, illness, loss, failure, doubt, and all of that can throw us into anxiety. Kierkegaard sees this anxiety as deeply human and unavoidable. but he also sees it as an opportunity. Anxiety is where the possibility of faith is born, because when everything slips through our hands, when external supports collapse, when we no longer know where to go, space opens up for trusting something greater. Faith, then, isn't an escape from anxiety. It's facing it. It's looking at emptiness, suffering, and the absurd, and still saying, I believe. Jesus lives this anxiety to the limit in Gethsemane, feeling fear, feeling abandoned, yet saying, Your will be done. That is faith in its purest form, not a comfortable emotion, but a painful and honest surrender. The blessing spoken to Thomas is not an attack on doubt. It's a recognition of the greatness of someone who chooses to trust without seeing. It's easy to believe when life is going well. It's hard to believe in the dark. Hard to keep going with no guarantees, when the ground shakes, when God's silence feels deafening. But that's exactly where faith shows what it is, because it doesn't depend on circumstances or external proof. It is born from an inner encounter with a truth that calls us by name, unsettles us, changes us, and invites us to walk even without a map. For Kierkegaard, real faith changes your life. It's not theory, it's practice. Whoever believes lives like someone who believes. They act, decide, love, and choose like someone who has already taken the leap, and now lives held up by a bigger meaning. That's why he criticizes a comfortable, shallow, purely cultural Christianity. He says many people call themselves Christians, but live as if Jesus were just an idea from the past. For him, being Christian is a radical calling that demands courage, authenticity, and commitment. It means living before God, every day, choosing love when hate would be easier, forgiving when it hurts, seeking truth when everything around you is lies, standing firm when the whole world mocks faith. Today, we live in a culture that values proof, data, evidence. Everything has to be demonstrated. There's value in that. But faith, as Jesus and Kierkegaard show, belongs to another kind of knowledge, the knowledge of the heart, of experience, of relationship. To have faith isn't to have all the answers. It's to stay faithful, even without them. It's trusting that even when we don't understand, God is present. It's continuing to love, hope, and fight, because deep down we know there is a greater meaning holding everything together. Faith isn't closing your eyes to reality. It's opening your eyes to another layer of reality, a layer you can't measure, but you can live. Many people stay stuck between the fear of believing and the fear of not believing. They stand at the edge of the leap, waiting for guarantees. But the leap of faith isn't irrational. It's beyond rational. It doesn't ignore reason, but it goes past it. And those who leap discover there are arms waiting on the other side. It's not a leap into emptiness, but a leap into a lived mystery. A mystery that doesn't remove suffering, but redeems it. That doesn't erase questions, but lights them up with hope. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. Matthew 19:24. That line is uncomfortable, challenging, and impossible to soften. It leaves no room for easy interpretations or cozy excuses. Jesus is saying something very clear. Wealth and power can become real obstacles to living the kingdom of God, not because they're automatically evil, but because they have a subtle and deep ability to trap the human heart in selfishness, self-sufficiency, and the illusion of control. Throughout his life, Jesus didn't just warn about the dangers of hoarding and domination. He lived a direct, embodied critique of every form of power the world calls success. And that critique still hits hard today, especially when you read it alongside thinkers like Ivan Illich, who saw in Jesus' way of life and ethics a radical challenge to the values most societies take for granted. In many places, wealth is seen as a blessing and power as an achievement. We connect success with the person who accumulated, who climbed to the top, who has influence. But Jesus offers a completely different logic. He says, In the kingdom of God, the first will be last. The greatest will be the smallest. Leaders will be servants. This isn't just rhetoric. It's ethical and spiritual. Jesus is questioning the worship of status, the belief that our worth comes from what we own, control, or display. And by doing that, he hits the heart of the economic and social system of his time, and of ours too. When he tells the rich young man to sell everything and give to the poor, Matthew 19, he isn't giving a one-size-fits-all rule. He's exposing what is truly holding that heart captive. The problem wasn't money itself, but the way possession was possessing the one who owned it. The Austrian-Mexican thinker Ivan Illich was a fierce critic of modern institutions, schools, hospitals, churches, governments, when they drifted from their human purpose and turned into machines of control, exclusion, and domination. But Illich wasn't only a political critic. He was also a theologian, deeply rooted in the Christian tradition. And for him, Jesus represents the most radical break with any structure that treats power as something sacred. Illich saw Jesus not as a moral reformer, but as a prophet of freedom. A man who refused to be king, who washed his disciples' feet, who entered Jerusalem riding a donkey, and who died like a criminal. All of that as signs of a deliberate ethical choice, replacing the logic of domination with the logic of service. According to Illich, Jesus' most revolutionary act was loving without conditions, something the system can't absorb, because real love can't be controlled by institutions. And that's exactly why Jesus' love is so disturbing. It can't be bought, legislated, or domesticated. Jesus' critique of wealth goes beyond social inequality. It reaches the human soul. Money offers a powerful illusion that we can control the future, guarantee happiness, buy self-worth. But when someone places their security in what they own, they become a prisoner of the very thing they try to control. Jesus points to this when he says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Matthew 6:21. In other words, what you protect reveals who you are. If your treasure is power, you live for competition. If it's money, you live for accumulation. But if it's love, justice, the kingdom, then you live to serve, to share, to build a world that's lighter. Jesus wasn't against rich people as individuals. He ate with them, like Zacchaeus, the tax collector. But he always called for a deep inner change. Let go of control, give generously, live simply. The kingdom Jesus announces doesn't fit inside the usual logic of power. It doesn't grow through deals with the strong or strategies of influence. It shows up on the margins, in personal encounters, in unseen acts. That's why powerful people often can't recognize the kingdom, because they're too busy protecting their own thrones. Today, the concentration of wealth has reached historic levels. Billions live in extreme poverty, while a small minority holds fortunes big enough to end world hunger. At the same time, political and economic power often sits in the hands of people who operate by exploitation, not care. In that world, Jesus' teaching remains both a warning and an invitation. A warning against a system that slowly crushes the vulnerable, and an invitation to a simpler, freer, more just way of living. Ivan Illich said Jesus' ethics disrupt the system because they aren't built on efficiency or productivity, but on personal responsibility, non-institutional care, and real presence. For him, Christian life is incompatible with a society that measures human value by performance or wealth. Living with less can look like loss, but in the Gospel's eyes, it's freedom. Freeing yourself from the obsession to possess creates space for what truly matters: relationships, meaning, community, generosity. Jesus lived with radical simplicity. He didn't accumulate. He had nowhere to lay his head. He left behind no property, but he left a legacy of compassion and truth that has lasted for centuries. That simplicity isn't misery. It's an ethical choice, a way of living that says, who I am matters more than what I have. And people who live like that become lighter, more present, and more available to others. One of the most challenging parts of Jesus' message is that it also confronts religion, especially when religion aligns itself with power. In many moments of history, the church partnered with empires, drifted away from the poor, and chased prestige and control. But following Jesus doesn't chase power. It serves with humility. He taught that the greatest must be the servant, that the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, that the leader must wash feet. And whenever religion moves away from that, it loses credibility. Illich saw this clearly. For him, Christian love can't be turned into an institution without losing its essence. Love is personal, spontaneous, and disarmed. Trying to organize it into power structures corrupts its nature. Jesus proposes a different kind of greatness. Not the kind that dominates, but the kind that gives. The greatness of simple gestures, quiet care, voluntary service, a hidden life that still changes everything around it. So the critique of power and wealth is not an attack on success, but on the worship of success. It isn't praising poverty, but defending inner freedom and justice. Because as Jesus made clear, when someone stores up for themselves and forgets others, the soul becomes poorer. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Matthew 5:28. This statement from Jesus, taken from the Sermon on the Mount, can sound extreme at first. After all, he's saying that a look filled with intention can already be comparable to the act itself. That goes beyond what any human law would judge. The law usually focuses on what can be seen, proven, and punished. But Jesus points to another level, the level of the heart, the mind, the intention. And this is where, surprisingly, he comes close to one of the greatest figures of modern philosophy, Immanuel Kant, who argued that the morality of an action is not found in its results, but in the purity of the intention behind it. For both Jesus and Kant, ethics doesn't start with the act. It starts with the conscience. Jesus consistently showed concern for the inner life, not only what people do, but what they think, feel, and desire in secret. He wasn't trying to create a religion of appearances. On the contrary, he strongly confronted those who used morality as a mask. By saying adultery begins with the look, he is stating that sin is not limited to a physical action. It is born in disordered desire, in harmful intention, in the way we dehumanize the other person. It's not the body that sins by itself, but the will that turns away from what is just, pure, and true. This kind of ethics demands more than clean behavior. It demands inner honesty, because in Jesus' view, what is hidden carries the same weight as what is visible. In the 18th century, Immanuel Kant developed a groundbreaking ethical system in his work Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. For him, the only thing that can be called good, without any limits, is a good will. That means it doesn't matter whether an action succeeds or fails. The key question is whether it was motivated by moral duty, not by selfish interests or desires. Kant believed a person is truly free only when they act out of duty, following principles they recognize as universal. If someone does good out of fear of punishment or hope of reward, that action is not truly moral, even if the outcome is positive. For Kant, real ethics lives in pure intention. That lines up deeply with Jesus' approach, where the heart is judged before the gesture. Both recognize that morality requires sincerity, freedom, and inner responsibility. When Jesus speaks of a lustful look as a form of adultery, he is not condemning the simple act of noticing beauty or feeling attraction. Desire itself, as a natural impulse, is not automatically immoral. The problem begins when that desire becomes an intention to possess, when the gaze reduces the other person to an object, when the mind feeds thoughts that break respect for someone else's relationships and for human dignity. That's where the inner boundary is crossed, not in the spontaneous feeling, but in the decision to keep feeding it in a distorted way. Jesus is saying that moral freedom is found in what we choose to do with desire. We are not guilty for feeling something, but we are responsible for what we do with what we feel. And that places us in front of a deeper kind of freedom, the freedom to direct our will toward the good. In both Jesus and Kant, we find an ethics grounded in what is invisible to other people, but visible to conscience. It's a demanding ethics because it doesn't need an audience. It doesn't depend on recognition or external approval. It is lived in the solitude of the soul. Jesus proposes a spirituality that looks inward. The intention behind prayer, fasting, and giving should be free from showing off, free from performance. And Kant, in his own way, also rejects performative morality. The categorical imperative requires a person to act in a way that could become a universal law. That's only possible when the motivation is real, not manipulative, not self-serving. Both are essentially saying the same thing. The truth of an action is in the heart that chooses it. Many times we judge actions only by their effects, whether it worked, whether it helped someone, whether it solved a problem. But the ethics of Jesus and the philosophy of Kant challenge that practical mindset. They claim that an act is only truly good if it comes from a clean intention, even if the result isn't what we hoped for. For example, helping someone just to gain social status is not a moral act, even if the help is real. The difference is in why you do it, not only what you do, and that difference is crucial if you want a truly ethical life, not just a functional one. This perspective calls us into radical honesty. It's not enough to avoid evil in front of others. We must also resist evil inside ourselves. It's not enough to look righteous. We must be righteous, even when no one is watching. Kant believed a person is free when they act according to moral reason. And that moral reason demands that we treat other people as ends in themselves, never as tools. This is one of the most important applications of his thought, respecting the dignity of the other person as someone who also has freedom and value. Jesus makes the same demand when he criticizes the look of desire that turns someone into an object. He is not only talking about sexual behavior, he is saying that any gaze that reduces another person to a tool for personal satisfaction is morally wrong. This critique reaches many areas of life. The gaze that manipulates, envies, uses, or despises. And at the same time, it offers another path. A gaze that recognizes, respects, and values the other person as sacred. By moving moral judgment to the level of intention, Jesus shifts the center of ethics. Public behavior is no longer the main measure. Inner motivation is. And that radically changes how we deal with ourselves. We are then called to a constant examination of conscience, not to feed guilt or obsession, but to build an honest heart. A heart where action and intention walk together, where what you do reflects what you truly want. And there is deep wisdom here. When intentions are pure, inner peace grows. But when life is marked by disguises, self-deception, and manipulation, the soul becomes divided. The ethics of intention is not only a moral demand, it's a call to authenticity, to live coherently, to think truthfully, to desire rightly. It's harder than following external rules, but it is far more freeing. When Jesus points to the heart, he is saying, I don't want only correct actions, I want a transformed heart. And when Kant demands purity of intention, he is describing a freedom that is guided by ethical reason, not by the chase for pleasure or fear of punishment. This ethics is deep, quiet, and revolutionary. It doesn't just change behavior, it changes the way we exist in the world. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Mark 10:45. This line from Jesus isn't just a comment about his mission. It's an existential manifesto. In an ancient culture, and in today's world too, that links greatness to power, recognition, and status, Jesus offers a different logic. Real greatness is found in service. Not in how many people serve you, but in how many people you're willing to serve. Jesus didn't just talk about this, he lived it. His life was marked by radical self-giving. He healed the sick, welcomed the rejected, washed his disciples' feet, and in the end, gave himself on the cross. Every gesture, every word, every silence said the same thing. I'm not here for myself, I'm here for the other. And that way of living inspired the theologian, doctor, and philosopher Albert Schweitzer. one of the most respected thinkers of the 20th century. Schweitzer saw in Jesus the clearest model of what he called reverence for life, a way of living that recognizes the sacred value of every life and expresses itself through conscious, selfless service. When we talk about service, we often think of occasional acts, charity, volunteering, donations. All of that matters. But Jesus points to something deeper. He doesn't just help, he gives himself. For him, serving isn't something you do once in a while. It's an identity. He is the one who serves, and that changes everything. Because when service becomes identity, you don't pick who deserves it, and you don't serve only when it's convenient. You serve because you recognize an absolute value in the other person. You serve because you see your neighbor as connected to your own humanity. In that sense, serving isn't about shrinking yourself. It's about using what you are, your gifts, time, knowledge, and strength, for someone else. It's putting your life in motion, not to accumulate, but to multiply meaning. Albert Schweitzer, through his work as a doctor in Africa, developed his best-known idea, the ethic of reverence for life. He believed every living being has intrinsic value, and that once a human being realizes that, they carry an ethical responsibility to protect, care for, and respect life in all its forms. For Schweitzer, Jesus was the highest example of that reverence, a man who didn't only speak about love, but touched the untouchable, stopped to listen to the forgotten, welcomed those with no voice. For him, service wasn't a burden, it was the highest path of humanity. Reverence for life, Schweitzer said, is born from direct contact with suffering. When you look into the eyes of someone who is hurt, sick, or alone, and you feel you can't keep living as if it has nothing to do with you, that's when ethics begins. And that ethics isn't mainly expressed in speeches, but in acts of care. We live in a society that often measures value by productivity. If you don't generate results, profit, or visible performance, you can be treated as disposable. In that context, talking about service can sound strange, like something small, submissive, outdated. But Jesus flips that logic. For him, serving is the clearest sign of greatness. It's not that the weak serve the strong. The truly strong person is the one who chooses to become a servant. That kind of service humanizes both the one who serves and the one being served, because it creates space for listening, presence, empathy, and mutual care. In a world where so many feel invisible, serving becomes a concrete way of saying, I see you, I recognize you, I'm with you. Jesus' service wasn't only in miracles or crowds. Many times it was quiet, daily, almost invisible. A touch, a word, a shared tear. That's the kind of service we're missing most today. Not the kind done only through big institutions, but the kind that comes from real attention. The kind that listens without rushing. The kind that sits beside someone. The kind that carries weight. The kind that holds a hand. Small gestures that may not change the whole world, but can completely change someone's world. Jesus shows us you don't need status to serve, you just need to be available. And Schweitzer reinforces that by saying, ethics doesn't begin in philosophical books, but in the private decision not to ignore someone else's pain. Some people think serving means erasing yourself, losing your identity, living for others in an unhealthy way. But the kind of service Jesus teaches doesn't erase the self, it reveals it. Because when we serve, we discover strengths we didn't know we had. Patience, courage, generosity, resilience. Service pulls us out of the center, yes, but it places us in a more truthful position, not as masters, but as brothers and sisters. Schweitzer saw service as a path to self-fulfillment. He believed reverence for life doesn't force obligations, it awakens vocations. And when service is done with freedom and love, it doesn't drain you. It strengthens you. Service is also a training ground against an inflated ego. In a world of selfies, performance, and fame, serving is a countercultural act because it shifts the focus from self to other. It breaks the illusion that we are the center. When Jesus washed the disciples' feet, he directly confronted their pride. They wanted glory, position, honor. He offered water, a towel, and humility, and then said, "Do what I did." That's the Christian model of leadership. Not the one who commands, but the one who serves. Not the one who climbs, but the one who goes down. Not the one who shines alone, but the one who lights the way for others. Serving is also a form of ethical resistance. In times of indifference, competition, and dehumanization, reaching out is a political, spiritual, and human act. It's saying life matters, that no one should be left behind, that another person's pain affects me. Jesus served not because he was weak, but because he was free. Free from ego, status, and fear. And that freedom made him powerful, not in the sense of controlling people, but in the sense of transforming them. Schweitzer walked that same path. He studied at some of the most prestigious universities in Europe, but chose to serve as a doctor in poor villages. Because he understood that the meaning of life isn't found in accumulating, it's found in giving. Deep down, all of us are looking for purpose. We want to know our life matters, that our time in the world made a difference, and it's in service, quiet, steady, sincere, that we often find that meaning. Because the person who serves leaves marks that time can't erase. They inspire, heal, comfort, and set people free. They make the world more just, more human, more holy. Life as service is not a smaller life. It is the highest life you can live. It is the life that imitates Jesus, not with words, but with actions. And as Schweitzer said, the only way to be truly happy is to live for something big. Behold, I make all things new. Revelation 21:5. This line from Jesus in the book of Revelation is one of those statements that hits deep. It isn't cheap comfort or empty optimism. It's a promise that reaches across time, feeding the hope that reality won't stay like this forever. That there will be a new heaven and a new earth. That pain will end. Evil will be defeated. And justice will win. That's the heart of eschatological hope. The conviction that history is moving toward fulfillment, that the world is being redeemed, not by our limited human strength, but by God himself, who commits to creation. And this hope isn't passive. It isn't waiting with crossed arms. On the contrary, it's active and engaged, a hope that moves people to act. And that's where the thought of Ernst Bloch, a 20th century German philosopher, connects strongly with the gospel. He describes Christian faith as a utopian drive, a flame burning in the human heart that pushes people to build a new world, even in the chaos of the present. When Jesus says, "I make all things new," he's talking about total transformation. Not just moral improvement, but cosmic renewal. Creation, wounded by evil and injustice, will be remade. Time, marked by oppression and pain, will be invaded by eternity. Death will lose its grip. The world will be reconciled with its creator. But this promise isn't an escape from the present. It's a call to responsibility right now. Waiting for the kingdom of God isn't sitting still. It's preparing the way through acts of justice, mercy, and truth. That tension between the not yet and the already begun is central to Christian hope. The kingdom is already among us, but it's not complete yet. We live in the time of promise, between the beginning and the end. And that demands faithfulness, patience, and courageous action. Ernst Bloch wasn't a theologian. He was a Marxist philosopher, but deeply interested in the utopian side of Christian faith. In his major work, The Principle of Hope, he argues that hope is the engine of history. It's what moves peoples forward, sustains the oppressed, and fuels revolutions. Without hope, he said, humanity dies before it even disappears. For Bloch, religion, especially Christianity, carries a powerful utopian core. When it speaks of a new heaven and a new earth, when it announces the defeat of evil, when it promises that God will wipe away every tear, faith projects images of a world that does not exist yet, but needs to exist. And those images aren't illusions. They are calls to transformation. So Christian eschatology isn't only about the end of time, it's about the meaning of history. It's the conviction that the world isn't ruled by nonsense or randomness, that there is an ultimate horizon that gives direction to the journey. In times of hopelessness, hope becomes an act of resistance. When everything says nothing will change, when injustice looks unbeatable, when suffering screams loudly, continuing to hope is subversive. Jesus lived that hope to the very end. Even betrayed, arrested, and tortured, he didn't stop trusting the Father. On the cross, wounded and abandoned, he could still say, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," because he knew death wasn't the end, because he believed in resurrection, renewal, and the victory of love. And his resurrection becomes the clearest sign that hope does not lie. The empty tomb is the first sign of the new world. Christian eschatology is born there, not as a cold doctrine, but as a living experience that evil does not get the final word. A lot of the time, the word utopia is used like an insult, as if it means an impossible dream. But for Bloch, and for the biblical vision too, utopia is not escape. It's commitment. It's looking at the present with clear eyes and saying, this isn't enough, this isn't the end, this can and must be transformed. Jesus announces a kingdom where the last will be first, the meek will inherit the earth, and the hungry will be filled. Is that utopia? Yes, in the best sense of the word. It's the horizon that shapes our choices, our struggle, and our love. So eschatology doesn't pull us out of the world. It throws us deeper into it. It keeps us from settling, from getting used to misery, war, and lies. It reminds us we weren't made for fear, but for fullness. Already and not yet. This is one of the most beautiful paradoxes of Christian faith. The kingdom has already started, but it isn't finished yet. We already see signs of it. In small victories of justice, in forgiveness that restores relationships, in solidarity that warms people's lives. And yet we also feel something is still missing. There is still death, still pain, still violence. That's why eschatological hope is restless. It doesn't get comfortable. It lives from the promise, but also from longing. Longing for a world that hasn't arrived yet, but already beats inside every true act of love. Jesus taught us to pray, "Your kingdom come." That request is both hope and mission. It's not passive waiting. It's a call to prepare the ground, to live the values of the kingdom now, even when the world resists. We often think waiting means doing nothing, but in the gospel, waiting means living in line with what you hope for. Anyone who hopes for the kingdom plants peace. Anyone who believes in renewal forgives. Anyone who looks forward to fullness serves. Jesus didn't only say he would make all things new, he started doing it. And he calls us to continue that work. Every act of kindness, every stand for justice, every honest choice is an eschatological seed, a quiet announcement that another world is possible. Christian hope, in Bloch's language, is a not yet that vibrates inside the present. It's an unrest that keeps us from becoming cynical. It's a fire that doesn't go out, even when the winds of despair blow hard. In the end, eschatological hope isn't only a theological idea, it's an existential need. When people lose hope, they lose meaning. They sink into apathy, conformity, and giving up. That's why Jesus insists on keeping that flame alive. "Behold, I make all things new" is an invitation to begin again, to believe that nothing is completely lost, that history can still be redeemed, that no one is beyond repair, that evil is not eternal. This hope doesn't erase suffering, but it transforms it. It gives meaning to tears, strength in exhaustion, and "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Luke 23:46. Few words carry as much silence, weight, and transcendence as this line spoken by Jesus on the cross, right at the edge of the end. It's not a sentence of despair, it's not giving up. It's a conscious, calm, radical surrender. Facing death, Jesus doesn't panic or deny what's coming. He entrusts himself, and that surrender, more than an ending, becomes a clear witness of freedom and trust. That moment, when life meets its limit, was deeply reflected on by the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, one of the most important existential thinkers of the 20th century. For him, the human being is a being toward death, meaning we live with the awareness that our time is limited. And that awareness shouldn't paralyze us. It should wake us up to a more authentic way of living. In the meeting point between Jesus' final breath and Heidegger's philosophy, we find one of the deepest truths of human existence. Death not as defeat, but as the final possibility for authenticity and meaning. We live surrounded by ways to distract ourselves from death. We hide it, avoid talking about it, push it away, cover it up. But the truth remains. Death is the one absolute certainty of life. Denying that reality doesn't make us happier, it just makes us less prepared to live fully. Jesus never denied death. He walked toward it with a clarity that's hard to ignore. He knew what awaited him in Jerusalem. He knew about the suffering, the betrayal, the cross. And still he kept going, freely. Heidegger said most people live in what he called inauthenticity because they run from that awareness. They live as if death is something that only happens to other people. But a truly authentic life is the one that accepts mortality, and because of that, lives with more truth, more intensity, and more presence. What Jesus does when he says, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," goes beyond everyday understanding. It isn't simply someone accepting death. It's someone handing himself over to death with trust, like someone completing a mission. That surrender isn't defeat. It's the highest kind of freedom, because only someone who has made peace with their limits can surrender without fear. Only someone who has lived authentically can die with peace. Jesus doesn't die as a helpless victim. He dies as an offering, by choice, as a witness that life becomes fully meaningful when it is given. Heidegger saw death not as the end of existence, but as the final doorway into authenticity. When we truly face death, we stop living for other people's expectations. We stop following the anonymous crowd and begin living what is truly ours. Heidegger says we are beings toward death because from the moment we begin living, we are already moving toward death. But that truth isn't just tragic, it can be freeing. When we become aware of how limited our time is, we stop wasting it on what doesn't matter. We start living with more depth, more focus, more humanity. That's the awareness we see in Jesus. He knew his life would be short. He knew his mission would involve pain. But he didn't run. He faced time with purpose. Every gesture, every word, every encounter carried meaning. Because he knew time is a gift, not a guarantee. For Heidegger, this is the posture of an authentic person. Not someone who lives on autopilot, or to impress, or to accumulate, but someone who lives with the end in view, and because of that, chooses more wisely how to fill the present. Often, we only understand the value of life when we come close to death, either our own or the death of someone we love. It's like the presence of finitude wakes up a sleeping clarity. What once seemed important turns out to be shallow, and what was invisible, love, presence, forgiveness, becomes essential. Jesus shows that not only in his death, but in the way he lived. He valued the moment. He noticed what others ignored. He stopped for a sick woman in the middle of a crowd. He welcomed children. He wept with those in grief. He didn't live in a rush. He lived with purpose. By surrendering on the cross, he doesn't only prove love to the end, he reveals that life reaches its fullest meaning when it is offered. And it's that movement, giving yourself, that turns death into surrender, not an empty ending. Christian faith is built on a deep paradox. You have to die in order to live. Jesus said, "Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." Matthew 16:25. That sounds strange, even contradictory, but it's at the heart of the gospel. The death Jesus talks about isn't only physical. It's the death of the ego, of pride, vanity, fear. It's daily surrender, dying to yourself so you can live in love. And in the end, It's also the trust that biological death does not have the final word. Heidegger, as a philosopher, doesn't step into the religious language of resurrection or eternal life, but he points to something decisive. Whoever faces death with awareness wakes up to what is true about being. And living with that truth is what makes a life authentic. Modern society tries to deny death at all costs. We create technologies to extend life, distractions to avoid thinking about finitude, and even shallow spiritual messages that promise endless happiness without a cross. But Jesus does the opposite. He embraces his humanity to the end. He feels pain. He feels abandonment. He cries out, and yet he entrusts himself. That surrender shows that accepting finitude isn't quitting, it's maturity. Heidegger calls for the same maturity, not running from death, but living with it as part of who we are. When we do that, we don't live less, we live better. We value time more, we value people more, we value connection. We become more aware of what truly matters. For Heidegger, death is the summit of existence, the moment when we are finally forced to be who we really are. No more masks, no more time to pretend. Only truth remains. And that's why living well is, in a sense, learning how to die well, not with panic, but with wholeness. Jesus dies with wholeness, no bitterness, no despair, no rage. His final words are not a scream of fury, but a whisper of trust. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. It's as if he's saying, I did what I came to do. Now I rest in you. This is the deepest surrender, the surrender of someone who lived fully, suffered fully, loved to the end, and because of that can face death not as a dead end, but as a passage. For Jesus, death isn't only the end of a journey, it's the final act of love. He gives his spirit like someone offering a gift, like someone sealing a promise, like someone trusting completely, even without visible guarantees. This death, so human and so divine, becomes a model of a life well lived, not because it was free of pain, but because it was full of meaning. I am the way, the truth, and the life. John 14:6. These words from Jesus spoken during the Last Supper aren't a theoretical claim about abstract ideas. They are a testimony about who he is. He doesn't say he teaches the truth. He says he is the truth. That changes everything, because it shifts the focus from information to a life that embodies what is true. When Jesus presents himself as truth, he isn't offering a closed philosophical system or a ready-made doctrine. He's inviting people into a journey, a path that demands consistency, courage, and commitment. And along that path we find a powerful idea developed by Michel Foucault, parrhesia, a Greek word that means the courage to speak the truth, even when it costs you everything. As Foucault studied the ancient Greeks and the early Christians, he recognized in Jesus the most radical example of parrhesia, someone who spoke freely, confronted injustice with firmness, and revealed truths that made people uncomfortable, and because of that, was silenced through violence. When truth is lived out in public, it becomes dangerous. We live in a world where the word truth has been watered down, twisted, and politicized. But in Christian and philosophical tradition, truth is not only what matches facts, it's also what binds the person who claims it. Truth isn't limited to what you say, it shows up in how you live. In that sense, Jesus is truth in human form. He lived what he preached. He loved to the end, even when he was betrayed. He forgave the people who crucified him. He refused oppressive power. He confronted religious leaders who used faith to control others. He followed his convictions all the way to the end. That loyalty to truth came at a high cost. He didn't die because he made a mistake, but because he spoke and lived the truth so clearly that it became unbearable to those in power. That is the heart of parrhesia, saying what must be said, living what must be lived, even when it disturbs people, exposes lies, or puts your own life at risk. Michel Foucault studied parrhesia as a practice of freedom. In ancient Greece, a parrhesiast was someone who spoke honestly, even knowing they could be punished. But Foucault goes further. For him, parrhesia is a test of integrity. It isn't used to manipulate. It's used to confront yourself and others with what is real. And that's what he saw in early Christianity, especially in Jesus. Jesus didn't use truth as a tool of control. He used it as a light that sets people free. He didn't flatter authorities. He didn't soften his words to be liked. He spoke with the marginalized, the lepers, the outcasts, the untouchables. And he also spoke to the powerful. And he told the same truth to everyone: repent, believe, love. Truth in Jesus is not about status, it's about witness and consistency. And that consistency is what gives his voice authority. He didn't ask people to carry crosses. He carried his first. He didn't demand humility. He washed his disciples' feet. His life was the message. The word witness comes from the Greek martyria, which is also the root of the word martyr. That isn't an accident. Because witnessing to truth in its most radical form means being willing to pay a price for it. Jesus became a martyr for truth, not because he chased suffering, but because he refused to avoid the truth just to escape it. He could have stayed quiet. He could have avoided confronting the Pharisees. He could have left Jerusalem, but he didn't, because living in truth requires commitment all the way to the end. Foucault described this kind of existence as a truthful way of life. It's not about saying the right phrases. It's about being someone who doesn't live behind masks, someone who doesn't bargain with their conscience, someone who doesn't betray themselves for comfort. Today, that kind of posture is rare and incredibly revolutionary. Jesus also said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." John 8:32. That statement has layers. First, it shows that truth doesn't imprison, despite what some people think. It frees us from lies, self-deception, fear, and manipulation. But that freedom has a cost: letting go of illusions. Because many times we prefer partial truths, half-truths that keep us comfortable. Facing the truth can mean rethinking choices, admitting mistakes, changing direction. That's why parrhesia is so demanding. It's not comfortable, but it transforms. And Jesus is the ultimate model of that. He didn't only free others, he lived free himself, because he didn't belong to lies, fear, or power. Truth, when lived with integrity, challenges structures. When Jesus said the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath, he challenged rigid religion. When he spoke of the temple being destroyed, he challenged the heart of the system. When he announced that God's kingdom shows up among the poor, he challenged the Roman Empire. These truths weren't just ideas. They carried political, social, and spiritual impact. That's why he was persecuted. Because when truth becomes flesh and blood, it becomes disruptive. Foucault saw this clearly. In a society built on normalization, surveillance, and control, speaking truth is a deeply ethical act, and a deeply dangerous one. And Jesus, by living truth so openly, became a real threat to established powers. Today, more than ever, we need parrhesiasts, people who speak with courage, who don't hide behind convenience, who don't live to impress, but live to stay faithful to what they know is true. In an age of fake news, manipulative speech, shifting morals, and manufactured truth, following Jesus as a model of truth and witness is a revolutionary call. Not to force ideas onto others, but to live with consistency, to reject hypocrisy, to make your life a quiet but powerful witness. In the gospel, truth isn't an ideology, it's a person. And to walk with that person, to live in his way, is to commit yourself to what is true, good, and just. Foucault said the parrhesiast speaks openly because they are willing to lose favor, reputation, and even life, but they are not willing to lose integrity. Jesus showed that this kind of integrity is not weakness, it's spiritual strength. Speak with courage, act with consistency, love with honesty, live without masks. That is the path of Christian parrhesia. That is the kind of witness that transforms, not because it shouts, but because it convinces through the match between words and life. Jesus shows us that truth isn't a place of comfort, it's a place of risk. But it's also the only place where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am among them. Matthew 18:20. Jesus isn't only promising a spiritual presence, he's revealing the core of his way of life, a life lived in communion, in relationship, in shared life. A way of being that breaks with individualism and points toward a radical solidarity, where the sacred is not found in isolation, but in real encounter with another person. This idea resonates deeply with the philosophy of Martin Buber, a Jewish thinker who understood relationship as the place where real life happens. For Buber, it's in the I-thou relationship, when the other person is not an object, but a subject, that we touch the deepest reality. And when two people meet at that level, God is present in the between. Jesus and Buber, each in his own way, affirm an essential truth. We only fully exist when we relate with authenticity, presence, and openness. Communion, then, is not just being near each other, it's a way of existing. Jesus didn't present himself as a teacher of abstract doctrines. His way of teaching was lived and relational. He walked with his disciples, ate with sinners, touched the sick, and wept with those who were grieving. He didn't merely preach communion, he lived it. And in that lived communion, something extraordinary happened. People felt seen, welcomed, changed. The tax collector felt worthy. The rejected woman was restored. The insecure disciple found courage, because Jesus' presence didn't judge, it freed. It didn't dominate, it awakened. That is the presence he promises will continue, where two or three are gathered in my name, meaning with the willingness to live the way he lived. There I am. Jesus becomes a living presence in the real encounter between people who are open to communion. For Martin Buber, human life unfolds through two basic attitudes, I-it and I-thou. In an I-it relationship, we treat the other as an object, something to use, manage, analyze. It's the common attitude in a functional world. We use people, interpret them, label them, but we don't truly meet them. In an I-thou relationship, there is a radical openness. The other person is recognized in their full humanity, their mystery, their dignity. They are not seen as a tool, but as a sacred presence. And in that authentic relationship, the I is also transformed, because only in the presence of a real thou does the I become fully real as a person. Buber says something profound. God is found in the I-thou relationship, not as an object up in the sky, but as a presence that lives in the space between two human beings who meet each other in truth. That connects powerfully with what Jesus teaches. God's presence shows up in real communion. Modern life has trained us to live fragmented, centered on an isolated self, competitive and self-sufficient. Relationships become useful, shallow, filtered through screens, shaped by performance. In that context, Jesus' call to communion sounds almost revolutionary. He teaches that the true meaning of life is found in sharing, not only possessions, but presence, listening, pain, joy, and more. He says it's right there, in that space of communion, that God becomes present, not in empty temples, not in cold speeches, but in the warmth of two or three hearts open toward each other. Communion becomes an act of resistance against the logic of programmed loneliness. A reminder that we weren't made for isolation, but for encounter. That life flourishes in mutuality. When Jesus says, "Where two or three are gathered in my name," he's not only talking about rituals or church services, he's talking about a spirituality of encounter, a faith that shows itself in real care for one another. This communion produces real solidarity, not distant charity, but shared life. Like what happened in the first Christian communities, no one was left in need because those who had shared with those who didn't. Faith was lived in shared bread, in embraces, in presence, in listening. Buber would say, those were I-thou relationships, people not using each other, but truly meeting each other. Not relating out of interest, but out of truth. And in that space, God showed up, not as a doctrine, but as a living presence. How many wounds are born from the lack of real communion? Abandonment, indifference, contempt, invisibility. Many people don't break down because they lack medicine, but because they lack meaningful bonds. They live surrounded by people, but with no one who truly sees them. Jesus healed with words, with touch, with the way he looked at people. He gave them back the experience of being encountered. And that itself was healing. Because when someone is recognized as a thou and not an it, something deep is restored. The person stops being useful and becomes sacred again. That is the power of communion. It heals. It restores dignity. It pulls us out of the performance mindset and brings us back to the gift of simply being. In an honest, present, real dialogue between two people, there is something you can't measure or fully explain. Buber called it the between, a space where God can appear, not as a concept, but as a living, transforming presence. Jesus promises, "There I am among them." He doesn't say above them or watching from far away. He says among, in the middle. In other words, in the between, in the bond, in the sincere connection, in the exchange that doesn't control but receives. This changes how we see spirituality. The sacred isn't only up there, it's between us, not only in temples, but in deep conversations, respectful silences, small acts of care. Jesus' invitation isn't just to believe, it's to live the encounter. There is no mature faith without communion, no real spirituality without concrete relationships. And that challenges us, because it requires listening, forgiveness, patience, presence. It requires seeing the other person as a mystery, not a tool. It requires stepping outside ourselves. And in a narcissistic world, that's almost a prophetic act. But it's also an act of hope, because every true communion is a sign of the kingdom. Every I-thou relationship is a crack where eternity slips into time. Every authentic meeting is a kind of resurrection. In Christian hope, the kingdom of God will be full communion. Every tear will be wiped away, not because pain will be erased, but because we will be fully united, fully seen, fully loved. But that kingdom begins now. Every act of communion is a preview of what is coming. Every true relationship is a small Pentecost, where 2 or 3 live in truth. Heaven starts touching earth. Martin Buber reminds us that we are not isolated individuals trying to reach God. We are relational beings who find God in the face of another person. And Jesus calls us into that path, to live a love that becomes presence. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. If this content spoke to you, if it made you think, sparked new questions, or touched your heart in any way, then this journey was worth it. Reflecting on life, truth, justice, and love through the teachings of Jesus and the great philosophical traditions is the kind of search that changes us, both inside and out. And if you believe more people deserve access to this kind of content, don't forget to share this video with friends, study groups, or on your social media. It might be exactly what someone needs to hear today. Subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next videos as we continue this deep reflection on philosophy, spirituality, and what it means to be human. Like this video, it really helps the channel reach more people. And leave a comment below. What part impacted you the most? Who would you like to talk about this topic with? Your opinion matters, and it can add a lot to the conversation with others who are also looking for answers. Stick around. There's a lot more content waiting for you in the next videos. Keep watching, keep reflecting, and keep going deeper.